Hello, and welcome to BGR's Roundtable. I'm Khalil Gillon, Communications Assistant for BGR, and I'm joined today by Natanael Pabon-Trinidad, BGR Research Analyst, and Stephen Stuart, BGR Research Director. Today we're going to be discussing 3 different bond propositions that are going to be on the November 15th ballot, as well as a proposed charter amendment regarding the city attorney. Natanael, let's start with you. We have 3 separate city bond propositions on the ballot. The city of New Orleans is asking voters for authority to issue a total of $510 million in bonds. Can you walk us through exactly what bonds are, how they work, and what they mean for taxpayers?
So when we say general obligation bonds, we mean debt that the city takes on to fund capital investments. So that includes the building of streets, roads, etc. And in general, these bonds are paid for with a dedicated property tax. That property tax is based on how much the city owes in interest and principal payments. Typically, bonds are paid over the course of 30 years, and that property tax that I mentioned is currently at 14.5 mils.
Let's dive into what BGR found and where it stands on the largest of the 3 propositions. $415 million in bonds for city infrastructure and facilities. Infrastructure is something New Orleans voters care deeply about. What would these funds do? Would they solve longstanding issues when it comes to street maintenance?
So our report finds that the $415 million for city infrastructure would inject much needed capital into, as you mentioned, streets, public facilities, parks and recreational facilities, and the like. This would help reduce the backlog of deferred maintenance that the city has, as well as overall help improve the effective delivery of public services for residents and businesses. Our report also finds that aside from bonds, there's no sufficient funding in the city's capital budget to cover this large project list. So overall, yes, this would go a long way to addressing a lot of the city's capital needs.
So how do we know that the city will actually use these funds effectively?
So the city's developed a list of 128 projects for this specific bond proposition. BGR finds that this project list improves transparency for voters as they can see the projects, a description of them, and what district is going to be affected by this investment. However, the lists lack cost estimates and projected bond funding. This is mostly because the city's finalizing these cost estimates. Final appropriations of the bonds, if voters approve them, will happen during the annual capital budget process, where again the public will have a chance for providing input and the like. So with all this in mind, BGR took a position in favor of this bond proposition with recommendations to fill that information gap with an accountability tool like a public-facing dashboard. This dashboard would show how the bonds are used, as well as what the ultimate results of those investments were. And our report also found that in terms of their capital investments, the city lacks sufficient preventive maintenance funding for projects like these that are funded by bonds. And we recommend that the city develop a stable funding strategy for this type of maintenance to ensure that these investments last as long as possible and we get the biggest bang for our buck from these bond investments.
All right. Thank you, Natanael, for the explanation. So, Stephen, I want to move it on to you. So there's a separate $50 million bond proposition for drainage and stormwater management. Everyone who lives here knows the importance of this system. But I thought that the Louisiana legislature consolidated the city's drainage under the Sewage and Water Board. If that is correct, then why is the city issuing drainage bonds, and how does this help the Sewage and Water Board?
Sure. Well, you are correct that the legislature consolidated the city's portion of the drainage system under the Sewage and Water Board. However, the city still maintains a number of significant roles related to stormwater management, one of which is clearing streets and culverts that are not subsurface pipes so water can flow to the catch basins. Another significant role is green infrastructure, which are rainfall retention projects that are built on various public property that the city owns, and those slow the flow of water to the catch basins so that the Sewage and Water Board won't have as hard a time pumping it out. If they can slow the flow, it allows more time for the drainage pumps to get working and make a difference in neighborhood flooding. This bond proposition of $50 million advances the city's portion of this work. Again, kind of a mixture of traditional gray infrastructure that supports the Sewage and Water Board and its system, as well as green infrastructure investments. The bonds will also pay for drainage studies in a number of neighborhoods across New Orleans that can help to identify flood-prone areas and possible solutions.
Okay. And in the same vein as the city infrastructure bonds, how do we know that the city will effectively use these funds to improve the sewage and water board?
Right. Well, like the city infrastructure projects that Nate mentioned, the City Council has adopted a list of projects that will be funded with the $50 million, and that list has to go through a public review process whenever it's amended, like the city infrastructure projects. And so there's greater public transparency. The public can track what projects are getting funded over time. Where BGR what BGR concluded on this issue was that the drainage and stormwater bond proposition is definitely something we support. We are in favor of it. We think that, like Nate mentioned with the city infrastructure, that you also need a public-facing dashboard with this so that the voters can track the actual allocations of money to these projects over time. The resolutions, as they're stated right now, don't include the dollar amounts of funding or the cost estimates, so having that additional information would be very helpful. We also support greater maintenance of drainage and stormwater management as part of the city's, longer-term objective to make all this work. And then, from a big-picture financing standpoint, BGR recognizes that there's greater investment citywide in drainage, both in the Sewage and Water Board and in the city's systems. And so what we urge, again, is for city leaders and Sewage and Water Board leaders to seriously consider a stormwater fee, which is a user charge that is paid by both taxable and tax-exempt property. So it's not just a new property tax that only part of the city pays. And it also is based on the level of runoff on a property. So it's really tied to the contribution that your property makes to the overall, volume of stormwater that we have to pump out. So it's more equitable in that respect, and it can spread the cost out over more payers. So as a long-term solution, these bonds are part of a bigger picture, and they're necessary funding, but there needs to be also this additional layer of new funding from a stormwater fee.
And I wanted to ask more directly about the stormwater fee. If we were to implement this, would it be a common thing? Are stormwater fees common in this region, or would we be one of the first cities to do this?
We would be the first city in this region,
Okay.
and actually in the state of Louisiana as well. Stormwater fees are fairly common in many other cities and states. There are several hundred of them that have been approved.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. So now let's tackle the third proposition, which is $45 million in bonds for affordable housing facilities. BGR has taken a position against this proposition. The report acknowledges that there is a pressing need for local investment in affordable housing, and BGR also found that there is not a significant alternative funding source. So why isn't bond funding an acceptable solution here?
So I just want to reinforce the point that, we found the fact that New Orleans faces very acute housing affordability problems, and there is need for investment. So the current proposal, unlike the other two we talked about, does not have a project list. Instead, the city's planning to use this bond debt to meet the new Housing Trust Fund dedication. So just as a quick recap, last November, voters approved a charter amendment that placed a dedication of an equivalent to at least 2% of the city's budget, of the city's general fund, to the Housing Trust Fund. So for next year, that would be about $14.5 million. So overall, we find that, the Housing Trust Fund budget process itself lays out a very transparent framework for using these bond funds, and there's many pros that indicate that using money through the Housing Trust Fund would lead to positive impacts on housing affordability. However, the main problem, and there's actually three problems that arise from using bond debt specifically to fund the Housing Trust Fund. Our report finds that one, it's a short-term solution. As I mentioned before, it's $14.5 million, so that $45 million bond proposition would only cover a few years of the dedication. It's also an incomplete solution in that, as mentioned before, bond funds can only be used for capital investments. So again, building a street, building housing development in this scenario, but you couldn't use it for the administrative costs associated with the Housing Trust Fund, and you also can't use that money for example, direct assistance to renters or homeowners. And the third and possibly the biggest problem is just the fact that incurring debt to cover a recurring expense is an expensive solution at that. And what we refer to that is the fact that bond debt comes with interest payments. So let's say in the course of a typical 30-year bond, the city, 40% of what the city ultimately pays back is in interest, right? So if you were to apply a 30-year bond to a yearly dedication, in the long run, that would be a very expensive endeavor. So for those three reasons, we took a position against the affordable housing bonds.
And what are the implications if the city does elect to use bonds to fund?
So again, we want to reiterate that we want to reiterate our position that we're against the city using bond debt for the Housing Trust Fund. But let's say if they do, we recommend that the city clearly communicate this to voters, as well as what the extra cost would be, and also that they take measures to lower that cost. So, for example, instead of issuing that debt over 30 years, you issue it over a shorter time span. This would ensure that even though you're going to pay more in debt in the short run, in the long run, you're not bearing interest over 30 years.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Stephen, did you want to add anything?
Just that the need for a sustainable source of funding is, certainly a concern right now in the broader context of the city's budget debates and budget deficits. But the idea of funding this obligation with debt is not really a true solution to try to raise the annual money that is needed to cover it. It's a mismatch of long-term obligations with an annual recurring cost. And so the city, as part of its overall budget deliberations, should, factor in how will it, develop a sustainable source of funding over time, that can fulfill the dedication that's laid out in the charter.
Okay, yeah. Thank you both for that explanation. Stephen, I want to leave this next question with you. There's a proposed charter amendment that would clarify that the city attorney represents the entire city of New Orleans. What does this mean? How does this amendment get on the ballot?
So this charter amendment does a few things. It confirms that the city is the principal client of the city attorney, as you mentioned. It also emphasizes in the charter how the city attorney interacts with the mayor and the council, so essentially the executive branch and the legislative branch. It describes how the city attorney should consult with them, how it should provide legal advice in a neutral manner, in an even-handed manner, and also how it should act when there's a conflict between the two branches. what BGR found in our analysis is that the current charter and the state's ethical rules for lawyers already provide clear direction on how the city attorney should act. The city charter, stresses in various places that the city is the principal client, maybe not in those words, but it does say that the city as a whole is what the city attorney represents. It also describes the legal advice that it gives to the mayor and the council. And then ethical rules provide fairly detailed direction on how the city attorney should engage with those parties and deal with conflicts that might arise. So overall, the BGR took a position against this charter amendment as being unnecessary to foster the positive working relationship between the city attorney, the mayor, and the council, as those provisions and principles are already fairly well established in the charter and the ethical rules.
Right, and I understand that there's a provision that would allow the city council to block the firing of a city attorney from the mayor, or mayor's firing of the city attorney?
Yes.
With a supermajority vote?
Supermajority vote, that's right. This would be a new provision added to the charter that would allow the city council to prevent the mayor from firing the city attorney, again, with a supermajority vote, which is 5 of 7 members of the city council. If the council finds that the mayor lacked valid cause for the firing, or if there was a reason that was not consistent with the independence that the city attorney is provided by this charter amendment. Where BGR had concerns in this regard relates to interpretations of this provision. The mayor and the city council could develop different interpretations of what valid cause really is, what you need to establish valid cause or other reasons for the firing. And this could lead to more conflicts potentially between the two branches. As an alternative, we think that the confirmation process provides the opportunity for the city council to evaluate the next appointee of the mayor to be city attorney on the basis of whether they understand their duties and obligations, their roles, how they represent the mayor and the city council. And it would also provide a way for the city council and the public to hold the city attorney accountable for following through on that once appointed.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Natanael, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, I think Stephen covered most of it. It's the fact that, even though this seemingly provides some safeguards or some new safeguards, we really take a position against it mostly because most of this is already laid out in the ethical codes that the city attorney and other lawyers must follow. And it's the fact that, as Stephen mentioned, really that new confirmation process would allow for a more amicable way of setting expectations moving forward than, adding a provision that could lead to some adverse effects in terms of the interactions between the three parties.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That being said, thank you both for joining me for this roundtable, for this informative discussion. All of our recommendations and analysis is available at our website at bgr.org.